Question Lane. Solving problems through the process of questions and answers.
The Question Lane is a podcast where the goal is to solve problems through the process of questions and answers. Today's guest is a distinguished professor of economics at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, or should I say the Ohio State University. As an economist, research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, he specializes in economic history and applied demography. Today's series of questions and answers will be centered on Area 1, economics, and Area 6, politics. Specifically, his academic paper, which was published in the aforementioned NBER, entitled Do Black Politicians Matter? So our guest today is Dr. Trevon Logan. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. What would you like to be referred to as, Dr. Logan, Professor Logan, or just Trevon?
Either Dr. Professor is fine.
Okay. I'll just go with Dr. Logan. Is there anything that you want us to know about you before we get started?
No, let's jump right into the questions and answers.
Perfect. For those that are unfamiliar with you, you're a black male, is that correct?
Yes.
As a black male, what influenced you to become a professor in economics and specifically applied demography as your specialty?
So as an undergraduate, I didn't have a desire to study economics per se. I took an economics class. But one course that really turned me on to economic history, and in particular, the prospects for economic history to answer questions that I had about racial inequality, was a course I took with Herbert Hill, who's now deceased, but he is the former National Labor Director for the NAACP, and he brought an entirely different perspective to the history of black labor. And really, he was a labor historian, not an economic historian, and it really turned me on to the fact that some of these issues that we think about as societal problems are also deeply intertwined with our economic institutions. And that really sort of started me on the path of thinking about economics. And then I had some other mentors along the way. In terms of demography, it was actually Professor Franklin Wilson, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Wisconsin, where I was an undergraduate. And at the time, he was the director for the Center for Demography and Ecology at the University of Wisconsin, and he really introduced me to the study of demography. And I saw how the two were actually related. So if you're thinking about demography as the statistical study of populations, clearly when you're talking about African Americans and racial inequality, you're thinking about population dynamics. And so there's a natural interdisciplinary hub right there in economic demography and in economic history.
Perfect. So when describing I noticed in your paper that we're going to talk about today, Do Black Politicians Matter? When describing the behavior of white people during the Civil War, Reconstruction, and also the Redemption eras, I noticed that the word opposition was used once and the word resistance was used 7 times. So what does opposition and resistance mean within the context of the paper?
That's an excellent question. It really depends on how you view the narrative and the historiography of Reconstruction. So there's the actual act of Reconstruction itself, right? What actually happened in and between 1865, say, and 1880, or the traditional date of it being 1877, where people like to end it. And then there's how we've thought about those events. So the study of Southern redemption is this idea that whites reclaimed things that had been taken from them in Reconstruction. And that would be their utter resistance to having new institutions form after the end of chattel slavery. And then there is their opposition to the new institutions, right? And so there's sort of two sides of the same coin, but it really is overall a desire to get back to the institutional framework that existed before the Civil War, which is a highly unequal society and a racial caste society. And so they're both opposing the new initiatives and then resisting actually acquiescing to any of the new institutional forms that are taking place. So you can think about resisting, for example, the introduction of public schooling in the South. And then you can be opposed to it by defunding it. And so there are active ways in which you're giving sort of more or less agency to the people who are trying to undo a new institutional setting in the South after the end of Reconstruction.
So, Dr. Logan, as a Black male that studies economics and focuses on demography, can you explain why it's very important to measure data, especially regression analysis, when it comes to studying a problem and providing a suggestion to solve it?
Okay, so let me answer that by going a bit broader than that. I don't always think that you need a regression to answer very important questions. I do think that many of the ideas that we have and claims that we make about the past are empirical. So we're talking about what existed, and we're talking about, and we're using quantitative language, right? So we might say this was larger than this. If we're saying something like cotton was an engine of the American economy circa 1850 to 1860, those are implicitly quantitative statements. You don't necessarily have to run a regression to assess the validity of those statements, but it is the case that you need to bring some data to bear to support those claims. And so regression analysis is a very powerful tool depending on how you want to build a case for evidence for what you're claiming to be true of the past. But I take a much broader approach that encompasses things that go beyond regression analysis themselves. I've always been very influenced and impressed. Robert Fogel, who is a very prominent economic historian, now deceased, always mentioned that one of the most sophisticated methods in economic history and in empirical methods generally is counting. Because a lot of things that we believe about the past might not even survive a very simple count of what actually was. And so we really have to take a very broad approach to how we're thinking about the past. If you look at a lot of the work in economic history today, it's more or less obsessed with causal estimates, which is essentially a subset of questions that we might ask about history, dealing with policy evaluation or the consequences or effects of policy. But those aren't the only questions that we ask about history, and nor are those always the most important questions that we ask about history. So I think regression analysis can help us answer some of the many pressing questions that we have about the past. But I think that there's a range of techniques that are quantitative and some are actually qualitative that get us to answering questions about the past and about the economic history of situations that we're interested in.
So can you identify some of those different qualitative and quantitative measures that we could look into as it relates to the past and how these problems could be measured besides regression analysis?
Yes, let me give you a good example from my own work. So undoubtedly you've heard about Black names, right? And
yes,
when people talk about Black names, there's a traditional narrative about Black names that Black names that we recognize as Black today, say names like Tyrone, for example, are a product of the Civil Rights Movement. And when you make a statement like that, you're implicitly arguing that there were no Black names before that generation of Blacks born during and after the Civil Rights Movement. So with some friends and colleagues, Lisa Cook and John Parman, we actually tested that proposition, whether or not Black names existed before the Civil Rights era. And we did this by simply counting in the census and then confirming our counts in death certificate data the fact that there was a group of names for Black men that were disproportionately held by Black men. And these were historical Black names. And when we identify those names and look at the share of all Black men who have these Black names, it's the same share, close to the same share, of Black men who have Black names today. But these names are totally different. And that study didn't use a single regression to establish that. It was simply using counting, because you need to look at the number of people who are in the population and the number of people who have a particular name and what their race is to discover whether these Black names existed or not. And that's what we were able to do in that study. And it actually then reorients our discussion of Black names, because it tells us that Black names have a history. And we're continuing with that work and now looking at antebellum Black names and to see whether the names that we discovered that applied to Blacks in the late 19th and early 20th century actually have their roots in the antebellum era when the naming of African Americans is still a subject of dispute among historians.
What's the name of that paper that you referenced about the names?
It is called Distinctively African American Names in the Past, I think is the title of the paper, but it's on my website.
I should definitely look into that because I've always suspected that distinct Black names is something that goes back, before the Civil Rights era. I've always had that just as a suspicion, but I'm glad that you looked into that, and I would be interested in reading about that for sure.
And your suspicion is confirmed. And the names are different. So they're names like Moses, Titus, King, Prince, Booker, Master. These are names that are disproportionately held by African American men and held by a relatively large percentage of African American men. And going on this further, so now we take this. We have a new fact. We didn't run a regression to get this fact. But now the history of Black names is much more complicated, right? So we're not just thinking about Black names as a function of Black power movements or the Civil Rights movement. This is a cultural perennial among African Americans. So the new question isn't about what do Black names mean because they're a product of the Civil Rights movement. The new question is, why did these Black names change? Because if you did a similar analysis with the names that we found historically, these would not be Black names today. These names are not popular names among African Americans today. So why is it that the Black names from 1890 to 1910 are not the same Black names that we see from 1990 to 2010?
Definitely something to look into for sure. I want to get back to what I asked you about earlier when I talked about using the word opposition or resistance. Would it be correct or just more accurate to convey your points to replace the words opposition and resistance with racism or white supremacy?
Well, yes and no. And I think this is where I really I try to be careful with my words because I think when we talk about the racism and white supremacy, and I deal with those more explicitly in a new paper that I have out called White Lashing, which is about political violence. It's important not to imply that the white supremacy was only practiced in the South. So one of the things that the paper details is there was a strong white supremacist movement throughout the United States. Even in the North, they didn't want African Americans participating politically. So it's not something unique to the South when we think about that white supremacist movement. There was a lot of implicit de facto support from the North. One of the reasons Reconstruction failed, historians now have a new consensus on, is that whites in the North were very afraid that some of the institutional changes being argued for in the South would be brought nationwide. And they did not want that in their backyard, which limited their support for Reconstruction in the South, even though they're talking about these changes that they wanted to have during the war itself in Southern institutions. And so to label simply those practices white supremacy, I think doesn't do appropriate justice to the fact that white supremacy was endemic in American politics generally, period, and not something that was specific to Reconstruction and specific to the violence of Reconstruction. So it certainly had a white supremacist frame to it, but that is not unique going on in the Reconstruction era. So I think to do that appropriately, I would need to really contextualize what I mean by white supremacy as opposed to the actual practices that they were doing in the South from particularly the violence.
I definitely agree with your sentiment, and I appreciate you contextualizing that because, for example, some books that come to mind just off the top of my head is Sundown Towns, which focused on a lot of racism in the North and Black people being told to be out of this town at this particular time and not being able to live in this area. So I definitely agree with your sentiment about racism not being limited to the South. When I use the term racism or white supremacy, I'm defining it as a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone that they classify as not white. Do you think that's an accurate description of racism, or what's your opinion on that?
So I think there's a big, I think really a debate, and I think a scholarly debate, and I haven't. So my first answer to your question is, I think it's important, particularly for me as a historian, to always contextualize what I'm saying in a particular instance. I think sometimes historians go too far to say this person wasn't they weren't out of step for their time in the ways they believe it about this or that. But it's important to note that we've changed about what people consider, quote unquote, racism, what people consider white supremacy. So I think the first thing that we have to do, as you were saying, is we have to make an argument about what white supremacy is and then see if we find evidence of it in the past. But the issue with white supremacy itself is that it changes over time in its rhetoric, and it changes over time in its technique. There are times in which it morphs to class relationships, times in which it morphs to gender relationships. And so all of that as a system, times in which it morphs, and it certainly is influenced by patriarchy, which has a strong white supremacist element to it. So it's important when we talk about white supremacy to really contextualize what it means in the particular situation that we're studying. Because my fear, and this is just my personal fear, is that painting white supremacy as like this cloud over everything removes the agency from the specific actions that people are participating in to uphold that system. So getting back to your question about using opposition and resistance, being a white supremacist does not necessarily mean that one is actively participating in the resistance and the opposition. Certainly, if you're participating in the resistance and opposition, you're a white supremacist. But I want to be very clear that I'm not letting people who are not active in that off of the hook for their own white supremacy.
Yeah, and I just to offer a little bit of pushback, I definitely agree with what you're saying, and I understand the logic that you're espousing. I just want to put my definition out there, and if you agree, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine as well. But the definition I provided was a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating. And the abusing part, that could be classified with people who are in the South that want to have violent approaches and violent actions towards black people. And the subjugating part could also be applied to people in the North who didn't necessarily have a hands-on approach, but they didn't want black people to participate in politics. So my definition encompasses people who are active with being violent and people who are being more passive, which is not allowing black progression in terms of economics, education, entertainment, etc. So, if you agree with the definition, that's fine. But if you don't, that's fine as well. I just wanted to be clear about what I mean when I use the term racism and white supremacy.
Yeah, I hope that you can see in my answer. I agree with your definition because it's much broader than I think we particularly in our popular discussion, we have this belief that you've got to be a dues-paying member of the Ku Klux Klan walking around every day with a white hood on to be a racist and to be a white supremacist, right? But white supremacy can actually be upheld by your inaction and your inattention to actually undoing the institutional frameworks that exist. So that's very important. So that's key to your definition, right? Which is you don't have to be active in the subjugation of people, but if you're not active in not subjugating people and in freeing people, you're implicitly supporting the system. So you are complicit in this white supremacist system. So the only people, I guess another way of thinking about your definition is the only people who can be said to not be white supremacists, given the global nature of the system, are those who are actively resisting it.
Okay.
So now with the status quo, if you're supporting the status quo, supporting a white supremacist system, right? You have to be active in wanting to actually dismantle that or challenge it or contest it.
Well, I guess that would probably be something that I could ask the white people directly. But I don't want to harp on it too much because I feel like I'm going to go on a discussion about this for too long.
Yeah. But I do think it's a framework for thinking about it, because a lot of times we're always thinking about action and action and action. But we forget that inaction is in it. It's like, not making a choice is a choice. Inaction is an action. And it's an action that certainly supports the status quo. And I think that is a really important point to drive home about how these systems and institutions are maintained.
So I'm gonna kind of take this discussion on a different course here. So who do you think during this period that you referenced in the paper, who do you think was most confused about racism, white people or black people at that time?
Most confused about racism?
Yes, about what it is and how the system works and their position within the system.
It's an interesting question to ask and answer, because now thinking about this context, right? You have, going into the Civil War, the Dred Scott decision, right? Which says that all black people, whether they are free or not, are not citizens of the United States, and in fact have no rights which whites are bound to respect. That is literally a racialized statement about what America is. Now, that's immediately contested in many jurisdictions in the North, for example, about the rights that African Americans have and don't have. But it is still the case that African Americans are not full political participants, even free blacks, in the North. So we already have this system which has told African Americans explicitly that they're less than. And this doesn't hinge upon the chattel slavery system. And I think that's an important context to understand what's going on during Reconstruction. Because against that backdrop, you now have a war for freeing enslaved people who are now emancipated. And now the critical question becomes, who are these people as citizens? They're now citizens of the United States. But that in and of itself does not mean that they have equal citizenship. So the people who are confused in this situation, I find, are not the formerly enslaved. They're not free blacks who understand what full political participation should mean. It would mean to them because they've observed full political participation by whites for generations, and they now want to take part of that. So they're claiming boldly, and this is 10 years after Dred Scott, their right to politically participate in the United States. And whites are confused by this because they fought for this freedom, and now they have this freedom, whether they were for or against it, it has happened. And they don't know how to assess or even think about blacks as equal citizens in this country. They're utterly confused about what black people should be doing and who they should be, where they should be, whether they should be part of the United States or not.
So just to be clear, you think during that time white people were more confused about racism, what it is, and how it works in their place within the system?
I don't think they were. I don't think people are ever confused about racism, because if you ask, you really have to, in that way, think about what people's idiosyncratic definitions of racism are. And it's clear in the late 19th century, people who were, you could be politically overtly racist in the Reconstruction era and after, right? In a way that you would have much more difficulty doing, say, in 20th century American politics. You could be overtly racist and white supremacist. The question is, and when I talk about confusion, I'm thinking about, say, the white electorate is very divided about what to do about this issue of equality for African Americans. So you have some who believe, well, here's what equality for blacks means, but they're not really equal to white people. Others who are arguing for full and complete equality and equity of citizenship. And others who are saying we need to go back to what we had before, which is no rights for these African Americans and remove them from the political process entirely. So when I'm talking about sort of whites being confused within those sets of groups, and I'm defining these in a very crude way, they are not confused. But now if you sum them together as the political opinions of whites at the time, that's a very, very wide range of opinions. So you would have inherently some confusion. Now, people are internally consistent among themselves, but as a group, there is a great deal of confusion about what to do with this group of people. You don't see that sort of confusion amongst African Americans themselves about where their place should be, what racism is, and how it's operating on them to try to deprive them of their rights. So they're not confused at all. They understand as citizens they should be seeking redress for their grievances. They understand that what full citizenship means is they should be able to negotiate contracts on equal terms, et cetera, et cetera. And so this they have no confusion about themselves. It is whites who are very confused about the role of the state, establishment of citizenship for blacks, and what that means for them. And so it's difficult to sort of answer that question without thinking about the collective of whites and the range of political and social opinions that they had.
I'll definitely I'll table that because I have some interesting questions about that specifically, because I brought that question up for a reason. But so why did you? Let me get to my question here. So what problem did you attempt to solve by researching and producing this report?
I don't think it necessarily solves a problem, although I think it's more abstract. It solves the problem of our gap in knowledge about something. But the question I was really seeking to answer is a relatively simple one, but one that simply hadn't been asked before. And this goes back to something I was saying about the historiography of Reconstruction. There was a very strong and influential school of thought that viewed Reconstruction as a failure because the South really did not undergo systemic and radical institutional change after the Civil War. And so people who view it as a failure see, well, this was just a wasted effort. We tried it and it didn't work. And this would mean that black political leaders were incompetent, that institutional change was simply something that the South could not do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the question I wanted to ask in that was, well, what did black politicians do? Because there were so many of them. And were they actually effective? Was there anything that black politicians did that we can see tangibly and quantitatively that had an impact? And I find that that is the case, that this narrative that Reconstruction failed is actually seriously troubled. And now I'm not the first person to trouble this narrative. But what I'm adding to it is a strong empirical basis for arguing that Reconstruction was actually quite beneficial to African Americans and could have led to strong institutional transformation had it been allowed to develop as fully as it was beginning at that time.
Can you identify the black politicians and their two major issues that they focused on during that time period?
Yeah, so what I do in the paper, and this had not been done before on both issues, was I did a relatively exhaustive search of black politician statements, et cetera, at the time to see what were the areas of policy agreement among the black politicians. And I found two specific areas where there was nearly universal agreement. The black politicians were all in accord on these two issues. And the first was education. And this is not a new finding for anyone who's investigated this. This goes all the way back to Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. But African Americans were decidedly on the side of an expansive and relatively well-funded public education system in the South. They really did believe in education as a means for advancement. And once again, getting back to this question of what citizenship means, that being full and equal citizens required them to be educated citizens. And they believed in supporting that public education system. The second was they believed in land, which you would call land redistribution in terms of the policy, but it really is wealth redistribution because land was the holding of wealth, particularly in the antebellum South. And the idea there was to have wealth redistribution in a relatively benign way that would allow African Americans to control their economic destiny and to become owners of means of production. And particularly if you're thinking in an agricultural industry, that's going to be ownership of land. And they were arguing for land ownership. And so those were the two areas of policy agreement. And they had means and political tools that they wanted to use to see those actually brought to light.
So the education aspect, I agree. I've heard about, and throughout my life, education has always been a focal point of black politicians and their platforms. But the land reform part, which is something that I read in your paper, was something that I didn't know about. But was it true redistribution of land, or was it more along the lines of black people being able to buy land if it's seized because taxes were not paid for by the white landowners?
Yeah, that's a very good, and this is an excellent point to make because this is really important. What black politicians are arguing for was redistribution. And redistribution, and when I talk about this in a benign way, is if you increase the taxes on land, you change the incentives for a landowner to hold large amounts of land. What we know from the agricultural statistics is that the South had much more land in inventory than the North. And of course, people who would know this firsthand would be formerly enslaved people who worked the land. And what I mean by land in inventory is literally land that's sitting on a plantation that has not been cleared and is not cultivating any crop. It is not productive at all. It's literally unimproved land. It's just sitting in a forest state, an unimproved state. The South had more land as a percentage of its arable land in inventory than the North. And these politicians understood that these are vast areas of what they would just call wasteland, like land that's just not being used. So if we tax that land, you give the owners an incentive to do one of two things. Either start using and clearing that land and employing people on that land, which is going to stimulate a demand for labor and raise the wages of those who would work on that land, or you give them a strong incentive to sell it. And so either one of those they believed will be largely redistributed either through the channel of higher wages, but they were really eyeing redistribution in terms of allowing African Americans to own land. Now that is separate from the issue of land that is seized for non-payment of taxes, which was supposed to be divided into much smaller parcels and sold to the public. And that just turned out not to be the case. So they were not thinking that what they would do is raise taxes and have land that would be seized for non-payment of taxes, and then that land would be redistributed to African Americans. That is not what I see the politicians arguing for. They really want to induce large-scale private sales of land in response to property taxes.
So they wanted to create a market where land was available for black people to actually buy and cultivate and work the land, correct?
Yes, exactly.
So that wouldn't be, I wouldn't define that as more redistribution. That's more just creating, like you said, creating an incentive to work the land. And if you don't have that ability to do that or willingness to do it, then put it on the open market and let the citizens be more productive and to be productive with their time and their use of energy.
So I want to be clear here. So the reason I'm saying redistributive is you're using the tax system as a means to encourage that redistribution. In other words, without the taxes, that doesn't happen. And so this redistribution is bringing other people into land ownership and new people into land ownership. And that is the redistribution. So it does have a redistributive element. But as I said, and I agree with your comment, that it's really a benign way of doing it, right? So it's not directly let's seize all of this land and give it to these other, and seize land from one person and give it to another, which is a very much more forceful way of doing redistribution. This is a much more benign way, but it has the same effect. But it's using the private market.
As a collective, where would formerly enslaved Black people get the money to purchase this land? Or would this be more in line of allowing free Blacks the ability to buy this land?
You have asked the $1 million question, and as you search this, and they talk about this, and they say things like, if we tax this land, say $1 on the acre, and these people have this land, we'll become landowners. They never discuss, and I don't see, at least in the records that I have searched, I want to be very humble here, that they talk about where formerly enslaved people would have the income or resources to be able to purchase this land. They do not discuss that, right? So it's this idea that land prices will be, so if you think about stimulating all these landowners to sell land, when they put that land on the market, it's an oversupply of land. It's a shift out of the supply curve. So the price of land should fall. And they believe that this lowering of the price of land would allow Blacks to become landowners. But it's not clear that ever occurred. And it's not clear where these formerly enslaved people in particular would have the wealth holdings and the income to be able to purchase the land. Now, there are some examples of collectives that formed and pooled their resources, as they did for the support of public education, to purchase land. So there were examples that they could speak to where this happened, where there were formerly enslaved Blacks who were able to purchase land. But this did not occur in any large scale that I'm able to see in the data.
That probably would be statistically insignificant, right?
Yeah, I don't find any large land redistribution effects. Right. So, and if you think about it, it's unlikely that it's going to happen given all the things that we've just been discussing. Right. So it's like any other sort of campaign promise. It sounds really good because we're not going to force anybody to give up their land. We're not taking any land from anyone, but we're going to institute this policy and we're going to become landowners as Blacks. And it simply just does not happen. And in hindsight, you would say you wouldn't expect it to happen. And so it's not surprising that it didn't happen.
Dr. Logan, that would be Exhibit 1 for Black people being confused about the system that they were in and what it meant to be Black. Because these are people who are, for the most part, uneducated, even though the literacy rates and the gap decreased while Black people were in office, as you've shown in your report. But these are people who don't have access to finance or capital or even have the ability to really read contracts if you don't have an ability to go to school and to be literate. So, it's definitely an interesting dynamic. There's a passage in your paper where you said, local and grassroots white resistance to Reconstruction era public finance was common during redemption. The Charleston Chamber of Commerce passed a resolution in 1871 to encourage local businesses to simply stop paying all taxes and withholdings and to overthrow the local Black political leaders. Can you briefly talk about this Charleston resolution in 1871, and would this be an example of white people not being confused about the system and what needs to be done to Black politicians?
So everyone understands that what you can do is try to starve the state of resources to actually enact anything or to carry out the prerogatives, right? So you can't fund schools with hopes and wishes. You need dollars to do this. So one of the things that white business owners were doing was actively, it's difficult to imagine today, but simply encouraging their businesses, their members, to simply not pay the tax. Right? Don't pay the tax And to be very, very clear about this, and so when I talk about the confusion, this is a group that's arguing that, once again, they're internally consistent. I want to be very, very clear about what I was saying earlier. They are internally consistent, and they know exactly what they're doing. They don't necessarily represent all whites, but they represent this group of whites who knew exactly what they were doing. They did not believe fundamentally, and this was much more broadly held even among those who might have paid their taxes, for example, that there was no good social return to educating African Americans. And that is not something at odds with many of the implicit arguments that people make today with respect to school funding. And I just want to make that point very clear, is that many of these political lines that formed during Reconstruction continue to have an influence today on our politics. And it's important when we talk about it, as we were saying earlier about racism and white supremacy, to understand that current that is running through those arguments. The belief fundamentally among these active racists was that blacks were inferior to whites, intellectually inferior to whites, and that education was literally a waste of money. Right? So they did not want to fund this because they viewed it as something that was truly wasteful. It's not clear if they would have supported, say, apprentice programs or other sorts of different ways of improving, say, workforce readiness for African Americans. But they did not believe in supporting a public school system that had African American students in it. And it's very important to understand that these school systems were segregated. So we're not talking about resistance to integration. We're talking about resistance to any resources being devoted to educating African American people.
And this is why I appreciate you outlining this in your report, because my definition of racism encompasses this, and I wholeheartedly believe this, that, you know, when people say racism, especially nowadays, and white supremacy, the idea that comes to mind is tiki torches and KKK and skinheads, but that's not what I'm referring to, and that's what I suspect a lot of people that are non-white, black specifically, are referring to when they use the term racism, white supremacy. This is more along the lines of a system where, just to be clear, like if I was speaking to a 5-year-old, I would just say non-white people at the bottom, white people at the top. Not having power in all areas of people activity, and that could include economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, war, all areas. Just not being in control and being able to make the decision. So I wholeheartedly agree with what you said, and I think that it's important to point that out. Another thing that I noticed in the paper was you talked about the Texas governor at the time, Roberts. He vetoed the appropriations for public schools as a matter of fiscal conservatism. Do you think that there's a correlation between citing fiscal conservatism as a way to kind of not have to fund public schools back then as it is currently as well?
My personal opinion is yes, but let me expound on that. There is this narrative that, you know, Southern politics simply is not a very generous welfare state, right? That, you know, if you go to the South, they have lower levels of funding for all of these public goods because they simply don't believe in investing in public goods. That is not entirely true. Southerners had and have had no problem investing in public goods as long as they are racially exclusionary. Right? So take, for example, aid to widows and single mothers. There is strong opposition to the general support of aid to women and single mothers, say in the Reconstruction era South. But Southern states have no problem passing Confederate widow pensions, right? So, which were actually quite generous. And these are funded entirely by the state. Now, if you create these Confederate widow pensions, what you've created is something that is racially exclusionary. There aren't going to be any black Confederate widows, right? So when you create and make these public goods racially exclusionary, then they become supported. If you can differentiate the funding for white and black schools, which is exactly what the South did post-Reconstruction, you can have a larger share of the resources devoted to white public education than black public education. And there's no problem in supporting those institutions. So it's never been just about having taxes or supporting public goods or people who should or shouldn't receive forms of these public goods or the resources from these public goods. It's simply about whether you can make them racially exclusionary or not.
Definitely agree with that. Another statement from the paper was the most pressing issue is that free blacks in 1860 could not be thought of to have any more than a negligible amount of political capital or influence. Why do you think that was the case?
Well, so one of them is, and this is something where I should probably define this a little bit better in the paper, because there are certainly many historians who have worked about the ways in which free blacks were continually contesting say, the Dred Scott decision and what it meant for their citizenship. But the problem with that in contesting it, if you're a free person, right, and if you have rights in a country, and this is, the way I would pose this question to anyone else is, you should have those rights in that country wherever you are in that country, right?
I agree.
If you look at the situation of free blacks, they had rights and different rights in some places than they had in others. That fundamental idiosyncratic rights and idiosyncratic citizenship and idiosyncratic autonomy tells me you don't have rights. Because if your rights are subject to the whims of whatever local community you're in, then you don't have rights. You're living on someone else's permission. That is not right. Right? Rights are those which cannot be taken away from you and are not subject to someone else's evaluation. So when I say free blacks had this negligible amount, I'm not saying that they were living in enslavement. But what they did not have was complete autonomy as any free white person would have.
Yeah, they just needed to have...
subject to someone else. Yeah.
I was going to say they just needed to have... a white minister in all of their religious meetings. They just needed to have, they just couldn't participate in public office, so. You can't tell me that's freedom. And sometimes they had greater freedoms in some places than they had in others. But that tells me that you're not fundamentally free. Because it shouldn't be a question of where you're located, whether or not you can do this activity or not. Whether or not your contract is going to be honored that you enter into as a free citizen is going to be honored or not. Whether you'll be able to testify in court or not. Those should not be things that vary over the geography of one country. If you are a citizen of that country and if you have rights in that country. Something that I found very, very interesting that you wrote was, indeed, after the Civil War, some free blacks sought political access at the expense of freedmen and only sought racial solidarity after Southern whites showed resistance to any form of black enfranchisement. What percentage of free blacks do you think shared this sentiment?
It's relatively small, and when you write these papers, you have to be a little bit more concise than I wish I could be in terms of writing a whole book about this. But this is really an example of essentially New Orleans. And so in New Orleans, you had a well-established group of free blacks who had actually relatively large wealth holdings. And they said, when we were thinking about the issue of suffrage for blacks, they said, why don't you have a wealth or an income restriction on voting for blacks, because they'd be able to vote. And the other blacks would not be able to vote. But they didn't care about that. They did not care about formerly enslaved blacks and their political participation. They were self-interested in their own. But remember, this is coming from a social system in which they viewed themselves as quite distinct from the formerly enslaved. And what they found, rudely enough, was that whites didn't want any black political participation. They didn't care if you were a free black. They didn't care if you had wealth. They didn't care if as a free black you had owned property. That was not in their interest. They did not want you participating in the political system, period. And that very quickly turned the insight that these free blacks used, because then they became much more general in their argument for suffrage. They understood that this was not about whether or not they could be special and seen as apart from the rest of the African American community. They understood quite clearly that they were in the same boat as recently emancipated individuals.
And I appreciate the explanation, because I would definitely be interested to see how, what was the numbers of free black people who had this type of sentiment and belief, because this would go to my theory about those people being confused about what type of system they're in. If there's a system of strict injustice where people are being enslaved and you're somebody that's classified as free, I would not be comfortable enough to think that, if any type of agreement was passed, that I would be able to benefit from this and I would be immune to any type of mistreatment that enslaved black people would be subjected to. But that's just my thinking. I could be in error about that.
Well, I don't think that you are, and I think you see vestiges of it today, right? There are people who think it's all about the money, right? And so if you think about these people, say, in New Orleans and Louisiana, they were thinking, well, we're wealthy. We're wealthier than a lot of whites that we know. So, of course, we'd be grafted in this political system. But money isn't everything in a racial hierarchy, and that's what they quickly found out. So there are people today who would argue that it's all about access to capital, and if you're rich, everything is going to be fine. There's no racial element about that. It can be the case that significant levels of income shield you from some of the negative effects of race. But I don't think it's ever been the case that there's ever an amount of money that can shield you from all of it. And that's then and now. And that's what they were really fundamentally arguing or believing, that they'd be fine because they'd be shielded from these negative consequences. And that just turns out not to be the case.
Yeah, and this is why I asked the question earlier about who was more confused about racism, because my understanding of black people then and now is that there's a group of black people who say that there's racism and white supremacy and the system should be replaced with a system of justice that's more equitable for all. And then there's another contingency of people who say that, all you have to do is pull yourselves up by your own bootstrap, just be more fiscally conservative and have more family structure and things will go fine for you. That to me is a real testament to the confusion of what the problem is that all black people face, regardless of your income level. But when it comes to white people, during this period of redemption and Reconstruction and the Civil War, there wasn't really, from my understanding, there wasn't really confusion about who's at the top and who's at the bottom. The discrepancy was mainly about how black people should be treated and what's the methods that should be used to make sure that you maintain control. Should you be more forceful or should you be more including to some degree, but with a limited capacity? Do you think that's an accurate assessment or am I in error?
Well, I think one of the things that it's important to think about is when we're saying white people and black people, we have to give some space for heterogeneity in that way that people are thinking about this, right? So the free blacks in New Orleans are thinking about this very differently than the formerly enslaved, say, in New Orleans, right? But these are both black people. So when we talk about being confused or not, we have to think about who all of these black people are and the range of opinions that they have. And the same thing applying to whites as well. So you may have more consensus in one group than another, but I don't want to say blacks are confused, because certainly not every black person was confused. There were some confused blacks, but I want to make sure that I'm not painting with too broad of a brush to say everybody black was confused, because there were a lot of people who had zero confusion at that time. So I think it's important to bring that element of the heterogeneity of belief that is out there to bear on how we discuss that topic.
I appreciate the correction. Because, there's no absolutes for sure. But I'm speaking more from a collective mind frame. And if I had to use a metaphor, I would think about it as racism being a house. Justice being a house on a foundation of racism. The question is the house of justice built or is it not? I understand people say that, it's in progress. We're laying the foundation and we're laying down the brickwork, but is it complete? That's my question, and that's my mind frame when it comes to racism. Is it a system that's in place, or is it not a system and justice has replaced that system? You talked about land reform, that it failed, and that but the black politicians led to a larger impact in literacy among black people and white people. Can you talk about how effective these literacy rates were for black people during this time frame?
I just look at the literacy rates themselves, and what I need to do and what I'm working on now is following up the people who were exposed to these literacy effects and what happens to them later in life, right? So I can look at them now and say they're more likely to be literate if they were exposed to black politicians, they have black politicians in the local area. But I haven't been able to follow that up yet in the research with how does that then link to the occupations that they had, their ability to migrate to other areas, their wages, et cetera, et cetera. So we do know that there's a strong literacy effect, but I cannot say what that literacy effect meant, right? So you could have a literacy effect, and given then the redemption period and the end of Reconstruction, it might not have had a material impact on their lives, or it could have had a material impact on their lives. That's an open question for future research.
You also talked about there was an increase in tenant farming as well. What's the difference between tenant farming and sharecropping?
Yeah, so the biggest difference, I would say, to sort of just a really crude way of thinking about it, a tenant farmer is a renter, and they can walk away at any time. A sharecropper can be held over to successive seasons when they are in debt. So a tenant farmer is actually renting the land and is of a much higher socioeconomic status than someone who is a sharecropper. So a sharecropper, for example, is out of the share of the crops that they earn, paying for their own tools, paying for their own subsistence, and it is common at that time to end up completely in debt at the end of the cotton growing season, which means you must work the next season in order to be paid. So it's a much more advantageous contract for the landowner to have sharecroppers who bear much more of the risk than tenant farmers.
And tenant farming was just renting, correct?
Yes.
Was there ever an option to take over the land by buying it after a certain period of time, or was, for the most part, this just renting?
For the most part, it's renting, but what you could do as a tenant farmer, or what was, be much more cautious here, what you could do is you were much more likely to be able to save to purchase your own land as a tenant farmer as opposed to a sharecropper. But there were some individual, and this is our idiosyncratic, are there some landowners who allowed their tenants to purchase land from them? Yes. Was that something that was ubiquitous? No.
So this is the last topic I want to talk about, reparations. This is a big topic in the democratic debates nowadays, and it's being brought to the forefront. What is your opinion on reparations for black people who are descendants of slaves?
I think it is. I think there are two issues with reparations. I think the moral case for reparations, to me personally, is quite clear. That there is a significant debt from the expropriation of labor during the antebellum period, and then subsequent exclusion of the descendants of slaves from the expansion of the American welfare state and public goods more generally, that continue to have an effect on the material living condition of those descendants today. And that must be ameliorated, I think, for us to achieve racial justice. Then we move to the more practical question, which is how much should those reparations be? And that's a much more, that's a very different conversation. But I think that we're still struggling with or trying to, in the public space, establish this case for that moral imperative that would guide reparations. Is this the right thing to do? Should we do it? And that, I think, is the most important.
So having the moral aspect of reparations being acknowledged as opposed to actually figuring out how much it should be and what date the money should be dispersed is more important. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I think for a practical perspective, you have to have people believe that reparations is the right thing to do before you even get to this planning stage, right? So think about writing down a plan that would distribute these resources, et cetera, and then people say this is not the right thing to do. The question of the size of reparations is what comes after you decide that there should be reparations. And what's a bit, just the reality of it is people are still debating whether we should have reparations, period. And so I think if we're moving in order, we have to first make the strong case that, and once again, I don't think that the case could be any stronger than it just currently is by looking around at the United States. But to make the case that reparations are absolutely necessary. And then the question is, reparations for what? So this is very important. You could imagine saying reparations are absolutely due, but reparations for enslavement. So it would not include anything in the Reconstruction era or afterward. And there are others who say it's reparations not only for enslavement, but reparations for, as I was talking earlier, this exclusion of African Americans from the expansion of the American welfare state and overt discrimination that was state-supported against African Americans. So some would argue, so when we think about reparations, it's very important to say, what are you supporting? And when you say you support reparations for what? That then determines how large the reparations would need to be. And I think that it's still very much, I'm just naturally an economist and a pessimist on this, but I'm still very much not convinced that we have a consensus in the United States that we should have reparations.
Oh, and trust me.
Yeah, but I think we still have to have that debate is necessary.
No, trust me. I am by no way confused as it relates to there being a consensus. I wouldn't even think it would be 5% of white people, and there probably would be a considerable amount of black people who are opposed to it as well. I have no doubt about that. But for the simple reasons of slavery, and to quote Yale historian David Blight, he said that by 1860, 4 million American slaves were worth something in the range of $3.5 billion, which was the largest single financial asset in the entire United States. That included manufacturing, railroads, all different assets within the country. So, and those people never got paid. And if we're gonna debate about slavery or redlining or not having access to loan, what is it called when you come back from war?
Veterans benefits, VA.
Yes, GI Bill. GI bills, mass incarceration, the crack cocaine epidemic. There's a lot of reasons for why black people should get reparations, but the moral aspect in terms of that needing to be something that a lot of people agree with, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because a lot of programs like the Homestead Act, et cetera, these type of programs, I'm not sure how much support they had at the time. They were just seen as essential things to get the economy back on track. And I think that reparations would be something that could get black people back on track, somewhere in the neighborhood of between $5 to $10 trillion. Do you think that's logical?
So I think the estimate of the size of reparations depend on what the reparations are for. So I've been very, very careful not to say, I've worked on some calculations, but I want to be very, very careful not to put a number out there myself because it is dependent on that. But I think to my point about sort of getting to this consensus is that this still requires it to go through a political process. So when I'm talking about consensus, I'm not thinking only about, say, the American public, but the real, very real practical issue of moving some legislation through Congress, right? Moving some legislation through the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. That requires, in this political climate, that's a very heavy lift. And we just have to be very honest about that, right? So when we think about sort of feasibility of this, there's a lot of work to be done for this to be something that is feasible in our current political climate with the people that we have in the House and the Senate right now.
I agree, especially with...
And it doesn't mean that we don't hold to this, and it doesn't mean that we say, well, I just give up. We have to just continue to work on that. So when I think people say we can do it, I think that we can. I just don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. I don't think it's going to happen the next day. But we've got to be committed to it as a process.
And the $5 to $10 trillion estimate, that I quoted that from Dr. Sandy Darity, professor at Duke University in economics. But I definitely agree with you when you talked about this has to go through the House and the Senate, and getting legislation on the table is going to be something that's hard, especially with Mitch McConnell saying that President Obama's election was our reparation. So, it definitely will be an uphill battle. But I agree with your sentiment overall. With we still have to push, we still have to tread water and keep our eyes, to use a old metaphor, on the prize in terms of what needs to be done.
And we can end the conversation on this note, which is another thing that Sandy has always impressed upon me, which is, if you would have said in 1820 that American slavery needs to end, you would have been laughed out of the room, right? That doesn't mean that argument wasn't valid in 1820, and it didn't come until 45 years later. But people were saying that in 1820. And so when we think about this idea of reparations, I'm not under any illusions that it's going to happen tomorrow. But I want to be that person to say that we need to do what is right today. And I might not even live to see it. But if we don't continue and start that process now, it certainly won't happen at any point in the future. So we have to be at that cutting edge and make and say it and continue to push forward on it.
Perfect. Where can we find more about your research and maybe any upcoming events or books that you have that might be released soon?
Yeah, so the best way to stay in touch and see what I'm up to is to look at my webpage, which has almost all of my most recent work has been updated and linked there on my webpage, has my most recent working papers. And you can also just Google me or follow me on Twitter at Trevon D. Logan on Twitter.
Perfect. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate learning about this paper, and I want to look into the names, the distinctive African-American names paper as well.
Yeah, and we have a paper that looks at mortality effects of the names as well. So if you go to my website, you'll see both of those papers there.
Perfect. Thanks for your time, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
All right, you too.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay up to date for more videos by clicking the bell notification icon and following our social media. For any of the people, groups, companies, or videos that were referenced in this video, don't forget to check the description and or the pinned comment section. The Question Lane, solving problems through the process of questions and answers.